Bowls, bowls, bowls. 39 total, 12 involving the SEC, Kentucky Vandy. Maybe we'll see you next year. How many can college football's marquee conference capture? And it's a rose by another name this year. It's the national semifinal. It's college football royalty. Alabama, Ohio State. Does the Tide need to worry? Plus, we talk matchups, mismatches, and motivation as the SEC looks to deliver on its reputation following a 5-6 showing against the other Power 5 during the regular season. And this is the SEC in 60. I'm Mark Rogers of MarkRogersTV. We thank you so much for joining us, and we thank you, Dr. SEC Peter Flournoy, for giving us this opportunity on the SEC Fans Radio Network. So it's secradionetwork.com that you can catch us every weekday at 2 o'clock Eastern and 1 o'clock Central for the SEC in 60. We bring in some of the best bloggers across the country, writers and broadcasters as well, to talk about college football's premier conference. And we don't stop when the regular season stops. We don't stop when the national championship game is finally won. We take it 52 weeks per year, 60 minutes of SEC football each and every Monday. And if you can't catch us live, which is really cool if you can catch us live because we'll get the Twitter interaction going, but if you can't catch us live Monday at noon Eastern, then you catch the podcast on iTunes or Podbean. Just look up SEC in 60 or Mark Rogers TV. You can catch the video, especially during the holiday season with the festive tree behind me. You want to catch the video on YouTube at Mark Rogers TV, where I've got over 1,200 college football videos, not just on the SEC, the entirety of college football across the country, previews, predictions, game recaps, analysis. We're right now doing a series that we started yesterday where we are comparing each conference's bowl competition. So at the end of the bowl season, of course, we're going to hear that the SEC went 8-2 or the Big Ten went 3-7 or whatever the records are. So that's part of the story, but we give it context. We are looking at every conference's bowl competition and ranking it, looking at record, conference record, record against Power 5, point differentials, record against ranked teams to try to give some context to the schedule difficulty of every conference in the Power 5 this bowl season. So we have a great show today. We've got Zac Ellis standing by. We'll get to him in just a second. Zac from SI.com, and also have Connor Tapp from 24/7 Sports to talk some South Carolina in particular. Connor also going to break down a couple bowl games coming up in a few weeks. But first off, we're joined by Zac Ellis of SI.com. Hey, Zac, how are you?
Hey, Mark, I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing just fine. Thanks so much for joining us today. So, Ohio State, Alabama. We're going to cut the chase and get right to the good stuff here with the national semifinal. This a game that I would consider to be probably an 80-20 split in terms of fan prediction. I would think Alabama has some of the obvious advantages going into this game. So your preliminary thoughts before we start to dig in on this one.
Well, I think it's a good example of how the playoff, I think, worked. I mean, this is a good one of two semifinals that we have to look forward to, two premier programs, two programs that are playing their best ball at the end of the year, I would say. And I think in general, like you say, 80-20 split of fan predictions. I mean, I think Alabama feels like a safe pick here, but at the same time, you've got an Ohio State team that it doesn't seem to matter who they have at quarterback. This seems to be successful for them. I think people had questions going into the Big Ten title game of what this Ohio State team would look like if there'd be a major drop-off without J.T. Barrett, who was kind of a Heisman contender himself, stepping in for Braxton Miller, who got hit with an injury and was out for the year earlier in August. But they didn't seem to miss a beat. You know, they pretty much thumped Wisconsin, a team that also has been playing its best ball at the end of the year and had a Heisman contender. And, I think this game is going to be interesting to watch from Alabama defensively versus Ohio State offensively, because Ohio State can score points, but at the same time, you've got a third-string quarterback in Cardale Jones who played well against Wisconsin, but now he's making his second career start away from home against Alabama's front seven, which is a pretty tough draw for a national semifinal. So that's one way I look at it is how that defense, Alabama's defense, can handle Cardale Jones, because there have been situations this year where quarterbacks have taken advantage of Alabama's defense. I'm curious to see how that unfolds going forward.
Yeah, the thing we can't measure, Zach, based on the Big Ten championship game, is that Cardell played extremely well, 12 of 17, hit all those deep throws, most of them extremely accurate. Did throw up a couple jump balls for Devin Smith to win the war, but a couple of those were placed right on target. I don't think there's any question about the kid's athletic ability. His size is tremendous. If they've got a 3rd and 1 situation, he's definitely a threat to move the pile and get the first down. And also the arm strength, they say he can throw it through a brick wall, and we got to see some of that in the Big Ten championship game. The situation, though, was they score in the first drive, they score in the second drive, they're in the driver's seat. That would be unlikely against Alabama. He hasn't seen adversity against the top defense, and I think Wisconsin is a very good defense despite giving up 59 points. Obviously, the offense put them in very bad situations last week, but he's going to face adversity and probably going to face a situation, unless Ohio State loses by a couple scores or really it gets out of hand, i.e. the Notre Dame national championship game a few years ago, that he may have to make a drive down 24-20 with 2 minutes left to play, and he just hasn't had to do that yet.
Right, and I think that is something you're right. We haven't been able to measure yet. We haven't seen him have to fight back in a situation where he's really had to show his leadership and show his decision-making in clutch situations. And that might happen here because, like you said, they started out really fast against Wisconsin, but that's also something that Alabama likes to do, is start pretty fast. They've done it a couple of weeks now on offense, and this offense, obviously, everyone knows what Lane Kiffin has done there, and they like to get out of the gate pretty quick. And so I think that will be interesting. You're right as well, because we've seen them flourish in a game where they didn't have to really fight back, and there's a chance that might happen here when, especially, being in the Sugar Bowl. This could be a glorified home game for Alabama, depending on fan travel. Obviously, 2 great national brands as far as fans are concerned, but a closer draw for Alabama. That's why they landed there. So we'll see how that happens, because remember the last time that Alabama was in the Sugar Bowl, it didn't play that well. That was against Oklahoma last year. And Alabama also, this year in general, has struggled away from Tuscaloosa, with the exception of the SEC title game. Played pretty well there against Missouri, but you think about the way they played against Ole Miss and Oxford, losing that game. Arkansas and Fayetteville, just winning by a couple of points. LSU and Death Valley. But those were also games that were, a few weeks ago. Like I said, they're playing their best ball right now. And I think if Cardell Jones can get out there and make a couple of quick drives that gets them in the end zone early on, even if Alabama's scoring, not being in that hole early will be key for them.
And that's a great point you bring up right there in terms of the experience, because that was going to be another one of my concerns I was going to bring up for the Buckeyes. It's an extremely talented team, a lot of leftover from Jim Tressel, and then Urban Meyer has just supplemented it and continues to and recruit at the level that we expected. But at the same time, it's an extremely young team. They replaced 4 out of 5 starters along the offensive line. Some of those guys went to the NFL. Ezekiel Elliott, tremendous season, 1,400 yards rushing, just a sophomore. Jones is inexperienced, well documented by us and others. The defense in spots, again, very inexperienced. Even Joey Bosa, one of the best defenders in the country, just a sophomore. Von Bell, Eli Apple in the secondary, tremendous players with all sorts of stars next to their recruiting rankings. But, again, freshman, sophomore. A lot of inexperience on the Ohio State side, but you bring up a good point that Alabama, the experienced team, struggled on the road, where Ohio State, the inexperienced team, had its best games against the better competition on the road, going to Minnesota. Not a difficult place to play, but tough opponent, played well in adverse conditions, and most notably against Michigan State, primetime game, crowd against them, and they just played their best game of the season in that one.
Yeah, and of course Ohio State has that really head-scratching loss against Virginia Tech, but at the same time it's really hard to compare what a team is at the end of the year versus what they were at the beginning of the year, and that was what the second week of the season when they lost that game, and that kind of was an anchor on their season until the very end. Because remember that, I think that weekend or a couple weekends later was when everybody projected that the Big Ten was dead. They were out of the playoff, and suddenly that didn't happen. But yeah, I think you're right that we've seen two sides of Ohio State, but they've definitely shown that in hostile environments they can be pretty successful. That Michigan State win is one of the best ones, not just because of who they beat, but how they did it. It was a pretty dominating win. So yeah, I think this will definitely be a situation when it comes to fans being there with the Crimson Tide, with a Crimson stadium full of fans there. This could be definitely something you could fall into the category of adversity for them, and if they can strike early and handle an offense on Alabama's side that's played pretty well as of late, then they might have a chance. But it's going to be an uphill battle for them, I think.
You know, Zach, the one thing about the crowd situation is that this is not TCU or Baylor showing up at the Sugar Bowl bringing maybe 5,000 fans. Yeah, Alabama's got a decided home field advantage, used to playing at the Sugar Dome, or the Sugar Bowl, used to playing at the Superdome. Ohio State will bring some people, definitely. They travel just about as well as anyone. I think what really needs to be noted about the Virginia Tech game, I think gets kind of lost in the national narrative that J.T. Barrett's second game, we know all about that, but losing the 4 offensive linemen from last year's team, it was just their second game as well. And Frank Beamer's admitted as much. Bud Foster and Urban Meyer definitely mentioned it after the game that basically Virginia Tech scrapped their defense and really sold out for this game and really planned all summer and coached their defense up for this game to play a bear defense, especially once Braxton Miller got knocked out, to play bear defense, play their really good corners one-on-one on the outside and just sell out against Barrett and an inexperienced offensive line. And Urban Meyer and his coaching staff had no game tape on this defense, had never seen it before, and Virginia Tech pretty much sold out for this game, and it paid off, and maybe not paid off for the rest of the season, but they pulled off the win there. So Ohio State, Alabama, again, a name-brand game, can't get much better than that. We'll see if the Buckeyes can hang in there with the Crimson Tide. That Alabama defense is, aside from Auburn, I think we saw the formula there. I think we would agree, Zach. Nick Marshall, not exactly Tom Brady throwing the football, but he's capable and he's mobile, and he really tore up the Tide in the secondary for 3 quarters in that one.
Yeah, and I think that's been an issue with Alabama's defense. We've seen not just this year, but last year as well. Trevor Knight did the same in the Oklahoma game in the Sugar Bowl last year, and then earlier this year in the opening game, which was also in the Georgia Dome, West Virginia, Clint Trickett played pretty well with a lot of those long balls to Kevin White against Alabama's defense. And even though I think Alabama won by about 10, but I was at that game. It was a very close game. It was definitely not a blowout. Another example of Alabama kind of struggling a little bit to get going on the road or away from home. So yeah, I think for sure that we've seen quarterbacks that have exploited this secondary before. You mentioned Nick Marshall, not exactly a guy you would think that goes out and throws for 450 yards. Usually, each game he's more of a runner. He's been a little bit better of a passer, but he's not someone who's going to blow up a box score. But he had a pretty good day against them in a loss, and that's something that's kind of crazy to think about when you think about Nick Saban, who was a defensive backs coach back in the day. That's got to eat him alive with the success they have sometimes against that defense. But the other wild card in a game like this, in any semifinal or a New Year's bowl game, is you've got 3 weeks to prepare for these teams, and that's kind of a wild card for me because you give a guy like Urban Meyer or a guy like Nick Saban 3 weeks to prepare, and you never know what's going to happen. I mean, things can really surprise you. The good example is going back to the BCS title game a couple years ago with Alabama and Notre Dame. That game was just a blowout from the get-go, and it showed how the preparation worked for Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide, and that's going to be the thing you can't really predict here is what can they exploit, what do they find in this almost month-long layoff to take advantage of, and that's going to be interesting to watch, especially knowing what we know about a secondary at Alabama that has been that can be exploited at times, and you've got a good offense on Ohio State that can do that. But yeah, and I think going back to what you said too a second ago about just the youth that's on Ohio State's team, I think that shows the recruiting that we've come to expect from Urban Meyer at Ohio State. I mean, not many people can go and lose 2 Heisman caliber quarterbacks in the same season and still make a top 4 in the playoff, and that's pretty impressive to look at the depth and the talent that they have then they've been able to bring. And I think that says a lot, not just at quarterback, but at other positions like you mentioned.
And Zach, you bring up the coaching matchup. I think if it was Urban Meyer against just about anybody else, if it was Nick Saban against just about anybody else, we'd be talking about their track record in preparing a team for 3 to 4 weeks and the advantage, but they're facing each other. Saban going to have fun trying to mix and match with Kirby Smart against an inexperienced quarterback, and for Urban Meyer trying to continue to coach him up to be able to handle these kind of situations. So the X's and O's with 2 of the best going at it, that's interesting. I think the Buckeyes, again, when we talk about youth, there's also a thin layer to their depth chart. obviously at quarterback, what happens if Jones goes down? I think that's the unthinkable, and that's a Bama victory. Or even at running back, Curtis Samuel's their backup. He's an outstanding player, freshman, didn't get a lot of carries. They pretty much rely on one guy like they did with Carlos Hyde last year. He was the guy that just got the ball, where Alabama, T.J. Yeldon, Derrick Henry, they've got two backs back there. If anything should happen to Ezekiel Elliott, that could be rough for Ohio State as well. So any closing thoughts on the Buckeyes and the Tide?
Well, I do think it's going to be interesting to watch also to see how Ohio State's defense, Joey Bosa, like you mentioned, that front seven, who's done pretty well against the pass in other games, can handle a guy like Blake Sims, because this is an Alabama team that has a quarterback that it hasn't had in the last few years, a guy who can run. He can make those 3rd and 7s, 3rd and 8s, and turn them into first downs. He's had success doing that for a lot of the year. Now, he's not a run-first quarterback, but he knows how to scramble when things get crazy. But that's a big reason why Alabama doesn't give up a lot of sacks, and also because they have a great offensive line. Those two things combined, going up against Ohio State's defensive line, will be a lot of fun to watch too, especially when you've got guys like Amari Cooper on the edge, and of course the stable of running backs like you mentioned. But I think Blake Sims is the key here. He had a great SEC title game, and seeing how accurate he can be, he was very efficient in that game, not just with his arm but with his legs, will be a lot of fun to watch.
And what does Ohio State do with how can I let you go on this game without mentioning Amari Cooper? What's Ohio State going to do with him? They're going to have to pay a whole lot of attention to him, but still the strong running game. And outside of SEC camps, maybe there's not a whole lot of attention given to guys like DeAndre White, Christian Jones, guys that are very capable, that could supplement an Amari Cooper if he only catches 5 for 80 yards, only 5 for 80 yards, because Ohio State really brackets him. They can go elsewhere, They've got so much depth at wide receiver as well. So does Ohio State trust one guy in particular a little bit more? Probably not. But how heavy do they lean that side of the field against probably the best wide receiver in college football?
Yeah, and you say, is there anybody who can handle Amari Cooper? I'm not sure anybody has this year. I mean, he's had pretty good games and very, very consistent for much of the year. But you mentioned guys like DeAndre White, Christian Jones. DeAndre White actually had a better game total yards-wise and touchdown-wise than Cooper did in the SEC title game. And that doesn't mean he's a better receiver, but it just shows how many options they have on that side of the ball. And, of course, they have a tight end, O.J. Howard, as well, who was kind of highly touted coming into the year. Hadn't done a whole lot, but he's still a weapon out there, especially in the run-blocking game. So I think I think that Cooper is obviously a guy they're going to hone in on, but if they do that, if they're double teaming guys like Cooper, they have other options to do that. I don't know if they have an option in the secondary that's going to absolutely take Cooper out of the game, but even if they do that and take the passing game out, like I say, you've got Blake Sims who can run pretty well. You've got T.J. Yeldon, Derrick Henry, guys who can make you pay on the 3rd and shorts with the ground game. And so I just think there's too many options on offense for Alabama, and I think the Tide roll in this one.
Yeah, I think Ohio State, again, they get to the national semifinal, but if you look at the development of the team and the roster makeup with all the freshmen and sophomore out there, they should project to be extremely strong in 15 and 16. They might be a year away. They may have overshot it this year just a bit, and they're going to have to play a near-perfect game to hang with the Tide in New Orleans. We got, Zach, an amazing matchup here with Ole Miss taking on TCU at the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl on New Year's Eve. Zac Ellis joins us from SI.com. Our Rebels were in that championship mix about 7 weeks into the season, really hit a rough patch, and we would really be questioning whether they were leaking at this point of the season, except they bounced back in the Egg Bowl against the top 5 team, Mississippi State, and looked very impressive. TCU's look impressive from gun to gun. Of course, the one ballyhooed game probably given more attention than any game this season, Baylor-TCU, in terms of analytics. So your thoughts as we start to dig in on Ole Miss and TCU?
This was probably the one game outside of the semifinals among the New Year's Six that I was most intrigued by, and I'm fortunate enough where I'll actually get to be at this game and cover it. But from an X's and O's standpoint, it's hard not to love this. You've got a great offense that's out there scoring about 47 points a game. I think they're 3rd in the country in scoring in TCU, going against a defense in Ole Miss that I still don't think got talked about enough this year for how effective and dominant they were. I think they're number 1 in the country, just under 14 points a game allowed. The secondary, especially, has been very, very effective against the pass, which is kind of TCU's bread and butter is their passing game with Trevon Boykin, a guy who probably had a legit case for being a Heisman finalist. I think if he just had, played on a bigger stage in that final weekend than Iowa State. But yeah, I mean they've got a lot of guys. Ole Miss does in the back end of that defense on the secondary and the linebackers that can really make a big difference in this passing game. So that's what I'm watching going into this, and that's why I was intrigued by it. Was if you're a football junkie, nothing better than seeing a great offense going against a great defense and seeing what can happen.
And I think we need to put Ole Miss's defensive performance really in perspective, because for those of us who've been watching college football a long time, talk about 14 points per game, yeah, that's really good. But the context of how much scoring is really amplified and gone up here in the last several years. The kind of defensive performances Ole Miss put out there week after week, never getting torched the entire season. If you go through the whole gamut of games, Mississippi State scored 17, Alabama scored 17. One of those was a gift at the end of the first half that the officials missed on a face mask strip for a touchdown by the defense of Alabama. A Memphis team that scored 35 at the Rose Bowl against a pretty good UCLA team turns around and the Rebels shut them down to 3 points and like 100 yards of total offense. This just went over and over and over. Texas A&M, Kenny Hill's lighting people up early in the season. Then Ole Miss comes to town, and the score was deceiving. A couple of garbage touchdowns late. It was a 35-6 game with like 5 minutes left. They did not have a bad game. The Ole Miss loss was the LSU loss was 10-7. The Auburn game, the Tigers were probably the one team that moved it a little bit in Oxford and probably put up the most impressive offensive performance. And we talk about Alabama and how balanced they are on offense. Best wide receiver in college football, Blake Sims. Sure, it was early in the year, but they had just rolled up over 640 or 50 yards against Florida, the top defensive unit. Then they go to Oxford, and again, the offense only scores 10 points. So I think what this Ole Miss defense did really can't be exaggerated.
I agree, and I think you touched on it too, just saying where college football is going right now with the offense, the up-tempo styles, and the spread offense, and just in general with how much that's kind of taken over. Even teams traditionally that haven't been that way, like Alabama, that's the reason, Nick Saban said this after this title game, that's the reason that Alabama got where they were this year, is that they decided to go with a quicker pace and with a guy like Blake Sims. And that they were one of the only teams that were able to be successful and win a game against, the only team to win a game against Alabama. And I think this defense, because I was at SEC Media Days in July, a lot of the defensive players like Cody Pruitt, one of their safeties, said, we know how good we can be, but sometimes just because of Hugh Freeze's background and a guy like Bo Wallace, guys like Laquan Treadwell, sort of stole the spotlight with the offense at times, because we know the offense can be very productive, but like I've talked about before, you got to know which Bo Wallace is going to show up, because sometimes the losses that they've had, like the LSU game, are because they kind of shoot themselves in the foot with clock management, with bad playing decisions, and Bo Wallace is a good example of that in the LSU game. So yeah, I think that's the other part of it, is what can TCU's defense do against Bo Wallace and this passing attack that's been pretty productive at times. But I still think that the key is going to be that defense on Ole Miss, like you said, and seeing what they've done with less than 15 points a game against a lot of heavy offenses in the SEC West, the Alabamas, the Texas A&Ms, that we knew were pretty productive, and what they can do against TCU and an offense that's really turned itself around from last year being one of the worst, in the country, and Trevon Boykin not being a household name and not being a very productive, efficient passer. It's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, that Ole Miss offense is kind of compromised in a number of ways. Again, the Bo Wallace struggles and the up and down play and who's going to show up is well chronicled. They don't run the ball particularly well. They were in the bottom half of the league in rushing the football. They really don't have a hammer or a dynamic playmaker, although we saw Jalen Walton break one off for a big game to break open the Egg Bowl. Laquan Treadwell, of course, was the guy, much like Amari Cooper. He's lost for the season. The Cody Coors and the rest of the receiving unit is very solid, very good. They missed Treadwell, though, because he just snatched about everything in sight. So the offense, they're going to have trouble generating points against the defense that doesn't have the the name brand that Ole Miss has built up this season, but they were almost as effective as the Rebels in a very pass-happy, offense-happy conference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, you touched on the running game of Ole Miss. That's something that obviously hasn't really gotten off the ground this year. But against Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, they were able to be pretty productive. I want to say they had more than 200 yards on the ground and like 3 touchdowns. And if you can give Ole Miss that other side of offense, then it can be dangerous, because then you're giving, it's going to be tough for a defense to decide exactly what they're going to do with a guy like Bo Wallace. Because if they're one-dimensional, then that's when you can pressure Bo Wallace and make him make some poor decisions. But if they've got that run game like they seem to have and played pretty well against Mississippi State in that game, it's going to be tough for them against a TCU defense, like you said, that has given up, points before in the past. I mean, you mentioned the Baylor game earlier, 61 points in that game. 24 in the fourth quarter, I think. So we know what can happen. I'm not saying that Ole Miss is Baylor's offense by any means, but we know that the talent they have there and the kind of games that Bo Wallace can have if he really gets in a rhythm.
So you're a lucky man. You're going to be at that game, covering that game. That's one that I think everyone has circled outside of the national semifinals, Ole Miss and TCU. That should be a great one. Zac Ellis of SI.com joins us. Zac, before we let you go, let's hit on Auburn and Wisconsin. Going to hit you with one more, and we've got these Big Ten SEC matchups contractually agreed upon for a long time. These have been games in the Capital One Bowl, that's now the Citrus Bowl again, and then we've got the Outback Bowl and we got the Tax Slayer Bowl, or the Gator Bowl, if you want to keep with tradition and what these games were originally called. So we got Auburn, Wisconsin, and this is one of these games, Zach, I got to say, when those Big Ten SEC matchups get named, that one part of me really likes to see those two conferences go at it, because even though the Big Ten's been down from a prestige standpoint, from a money standpoint, eyeballs on the TV sets, those are the two conferences that bring it more than anyone else. And then also, I kind of cringe because, you throw out Iowa or Wisconsin, it just doesn't sound like they're going to be able to match athletically, but Wisconsin in particular, for some reason, they bring it. They won their share against the SEC in bowl games, or like last year, very competitive to the final 4 or 5 minutes before they lose to a top 5 team like South Carolina. So just your thoughts about Auburn taking on Wisconsin here.
I think it's interesting because you got two teams that kind of came off deflating losses in their last games. Obviously, Wisconsin, people probably expected that Ohio State might win that game, but I don't think anybody expected they were going to win by 50 and 60 points. I mean, it was pretty brutal out there. Obviously, Melvin Gordon did not have the game that we expected from him, and that was kind of key for that game, was what's going to happen when it comes to Melvin Gordon, that run game, going against Ohio State. But I think, too, on Auburn's side, had a pretty good chance to win the game in Tuscaloosa in the Iron Bowl. Had the lead for a while, but wasn't able to keep it going. And I think in this game, I want to see what Wisconsin's running defense can do against Auburn's running game, because we know what the Auburn offense is like. They like to shove it down your throat as much as they can. And even though we saw Nick Marshall, like you mentioned earlier, have a pretty good game through the air with his arm against Alabama, they might not have to do that against Wisconsin, but Wisconsin has a pretty good running defense in that regard. So, two teams coming off some disappointments, and then the other side of it is Wisconsin doesn't have a coach anymore. They're going to have Barry Alvarez step in there, their athletic director, and coach this game. So how does that change their dynamic, knowing that Gary Anderson's not really calling the shots there from a 10-win season where they got to the Big Ten title game? So we'll see what happens.
What's funny about that is Barry Alvarez just did that a couple of years ago in the Rose Bowl against Stanford when Bielema stepped down and he stepped in and coached. So Barry Alvarez, not coaching for 8 or 9 years, and he just steps in and coaches bowl games. Oh. And Wisconsin had lost 5 games and still got to the Rose Bowl. The Ohio State violations, they weren't allowed to go despite being 12-0, and Penn State was out of it because of violations. They were ineligible, and Wisconsin still goes to the Rose Bowl. And Barry Alvarez steps in, and they're a huge underdog, but they play within a touchdown in that game. So Wisconsin pretty much is what they are. They pretty much bring the same type of product every year. I could go a bunch of different directions in this game, but you mentioned Auburn is what they are, and that's run the football, despite a number of key losses, I think, in the running game, and that's why it was better last year, even though it's very productive still. Greg Robinson at left tackle, Trey Mason, the fullback Jay Prosch was devastating as a blocker. But they got those 2 wide receivers that we saw just tear up Alabama, Duke Williams and Sammy Coates, and to a lesser degree Quan Bray as well, and we see Cardell Jones just go deep to Devin Smith over and over and hit Wisconsin for big plays. So on the other hand, that running game is really going to probably set some things up downfield for those elite wide receivers to match up against Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I mean, Nick Marshall did do what people wanted him to do more of this year, and that was throw the ball and be successful, especially against an Alabama team on the road. So it's possible. They have the weapons to do it. They just know what they're going to do first if they have the chance to do it. And, of course, Auburn also doesn't have or has a pretty good or has a pretty bad run defense at times. So that could be bad, too. If they can't stop Melvin Gordon from making a difference in this game, then things could get ugly early because he might have a chip on his shoulder after missing out on a potential Heisman Trophy. If he'd gone out and had a huge game against Ohio State and maybe Marcus Mariota had struggled a bit against Arizona in the Pac-12 title game, things could have gotten a little more interesting in the Heisman race. But, I think Melvin Gordon knows he has more than he brought in that Big Ten title game.
So we're joined by Zac Ellis of SI.com. We've got Connor Tapp of 24/7 Sports standing by. Zac, before we let you go, Auburn, Wisconsin. Don't know if you've made picks on these bowl games, so I don't want to put you on the spot if you're still waiting to release your predictions for these, but Ole Miss-TCU and Auburn, Wisconsin, anything for us there?
I think I'm going to go with Ole Miss in the Ole Miss-TCU game. I think the defense is going to be too good. I don't think that TCU has faced a defense quite like that one when it comes to the passing game and the pressure they're going to put on Trevon Boykin. So I like Ole Miss there. Plus, it might be more of a home game for Ole Miss with their fans a little bit closer to the Georgia Dome. And then for Wisconsin-Auburn, this one to me is kind of like a toss-up because I don't know what Barry Alvarez is going to bring with Wisconsin, and Auburn, not really sure if they can have the same success with the pass. But I think I'm going to lean Auburn on this one, not to be the SEC homer here, but I think that Auburn has more options in the pass game and on the run game, whereas Wisconsin with Joel Stave isn't exactly a passing team. We know that. We know what they're going to do. And I think there's more options for Auburn to be successful against Wisconsin.
Yeah, I got to go with you on that one, Zac. I just think that's the big liability for Wisconsin. This is a top 15 program year in, year out, but they're never going to challenge the Ohio States in the conference or the elites outside the conference until they find themselves a quarterback outside the 1 year with Russell Wilson or big-time wide receivers outside of Jared Abbrederis for 4 years. They really need to find those dynamic guys because the rest of the team can compete with anyone outside of those two positions, but it's basically the same story of Wisconsin year in, year out. Mm-hmm. Excellent program, very proud program and team. I expect them to show up and make amends to a certain extent for 59-0 and play Auburn very close, but I just got to think that Auburn talent is just going to be a little bit too much. Hey, Zac, thanks so much for joining us. We always appreciate the time and the insight.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Zac Ellis of SI.com joining us to break down Ole Miss-TCU and also Auburn, Wisconsin, and of course the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, the national semifinal, Ohio State and Alabama. This is the SEC in 60. Of course, this is the live airing. The podcast is also going to be available Monday afternoons for you. You can catch that on iTunes and also at Podbean, and then the video cast that you have to catch at least during the holiday season with the festive Christmas tree behind me. So catch us on video, MarkRogersTV.com, and also on YouTube if you look up Mark Rogers TV, over 1,200 college football videos, many with this guy, Mr. Connor Tapp of 24/7 Sports. Connor, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Mark. Happy to join you. I'm sad I've just got wood paneling behind me. I don't have any festive decorations.
Well, the last time you joined us, of course, you had just moved, so you had all sorts of boxes and paraphernalia going on behind you, so we don't know what to expect from you. You give us something different every time.
Yeah, I try to mix it up.
So, as I mentioned, we got like 1,200 college football videos on our website and on YouTube, and Connor's probably helped us out with at least 12 or 15 of these covering South Carolina and the SEC in particular. Connor, let's break down this Miami-South Carolina game before we dive into some issues concerning the coaching staff and possibilities there with South Carolina coming off a disappointing 6-6 season. So you've got a couple disappointments going here. So this is sometimes the narrative during the bowl season. Big-time programs underachieve, and they find each other playing on December 27th in Shreveport, Louisiana, instead of somewhere they'd like to be, like Atlanta or Miami or New Orleans or somewhere like that. So South Carolina and Miami. Let's look at the Gamecocks. First of all, just in regards to mindset, and this is also the key element when we talk bowl games in these type of situations, motivation. Do you have any kind of pulse on this one?
The mindset around South Carolina, the program in general, particularly the fan base, is not good right now. South Carolina does not want to go to Shreveport, and I think as of this weekend, only 700 tickets had been sold to the South Carolina contingent. So Gamecock fans aren't excited to go back there. Their previous experience was playing Missouri in Shreveport at the end of the 2005 season, Steve Spurrier's first season with the Gamecocks, and that was a game in which South Carolina blew a big lead in the second half and came away very disappointed. And it's a really long drive from Columbia, South Carolina to Shreveport, Louisiana, to go back with a bitter taste in your mouth like that. So that's lingering in South Carolina fans' minds, I think, and there's just not a whole lot of reason for South Carolina to feel optimistic about the short-term program. I mean, and if you want to look at particular matchups in this game, I think, to me, the reason I think Miami has an edge is Miami is a team that you look at as having some nice components to it, some good talent on both sides of the ball, and you just kind of look at that 6-6 record and scratch your head about how they got there. But when you look at South Carolina, you know exactly how this team got there, and it's just not a very good team. And that's just been the bottom line for South Carolina, and it's been a difficult pill to swallow after having 3 consecutive 11-win seasons.
I like the history lesson. I think this could be history repeating itself. Yeah, you're talking about a top 10 team preseason that goes 6-6, and if there's any kind of motivation, typically we see, well, we've got a Florida-East Carolina matchup that I believe if Florida is motivated, they win that game just because it's SEC talent against a very good East Carolina team, but East Carolina. But we've seen that again. Yeah, South Carolina taking out Missouri. We saw that, I think, South Carolina, Connecticut. Was that not a bowl game as well?
Yeah, that was out in Birmingham at the end of the 2009 season, yeah.
Yeah, another situation where if you just look at talent on the roster, it shouldn't be a game, but motivation is different for different schools. Now, in this situation, both disappointed, and you certainly, South Carolina can't be looking down on Miami in terms of talent and speed, because this Miami team is pretty serious, despite, yeah, I think it's a head-scratcher as well at 6-6. They had Florida State down with like 3 minutes to play, and I know everybody had Florida State down with 3 minutes to play, but Miami really had a nice game plan and matched Florida State step for step, and actually had a 16-point lead in that game. So, how good are the Canes, Connor?
I think they're a pretty good team. They've got a really good defense. I really like their defense, especially against the pass. They kind of remind me of Florida's 2012 defense in that they don't sack the quarterback a whole lot, but they just do not give up very much through the air. And I think that's going to present an interesting challenge for South Carolina. They're pretty good in pass protection, but have struggled a bit against teams that really defend the pass well. You look at the Clemson game, and Dylan Thompson ended up with some pretty nice counting stats, but he was in trouble all game. So that's going to be an interesting matchup. And then on the other side of the ball for the Hurricanes, Duke Johnson, averaging 6.97 yards per carry on the season. That's going to be real tough for South Carolina to deal with. They have not been able to stop the run at all this season, and Artavis Scott for Clemson ended up with something around 180 receiving yards against South Carolina, but a lot of that was the little quick pass, little push pass at the from the quarterback to the wide receiver coming across on the jet sweep. So they were essentially rushing yards, but South Carolina's defensive line is just not equipped to slow down strong running games at this point. The defensive backfield, I think, has come along pretty well for South Carolina over the course of the season, but that defensive line has just not improved at all. Swapped out some new personnel later on in the season, but it's just the ingredients just aren't there for South Carolina to slow down anybody on the ground. So I think Duke Johnson's probably going to have himself a nice day. And Brad Kaya and Justin Dorsett have been a nice combination for Miami. throwing and catching the ball. So it's going to be a lot for South Carolina to try to stop here. I'm honestly surprised that I think I saw Miami was favored by like 1.5 or something. I would push it as far as a touchdown. I think the Hurricanes have themselves a good team. Like you said, it's a head-scratcher as to why. And if you look at their schedule and the teams that they lost to, with the exception of Virginia and Pittsburgh down the stretch, those are quality losses. So it's just, how do you lose to the Cavaliers and the Panthers, two teams that most people I don't think have as being very good. So it'll be interesting to see who's motivated, who isn't, because I think both teams are certainly capable of winning the game if they play up to their capabilities. But I would definitely give Miami the edge.
You're starting to sell me, Connor, because I saw this matchup and I thought, toss-up. This is the toss-up of the bowl season. South Carolina, I don't need to tell you, 93rd points allowed and 92nd in total yards allowed. And they played an extremely strong schedule, as they always do. But Clemson didn't have its Deshaun Watson missed that game, though. He got hurt.
Yeah, he was in and out, but he played most of the game.
Okay, he did play most of that game. 35 against Clemson. They weren't an offensive juggernaut like they had been prior to this season with Taj Boyd and Sammy Watkins, Martavius Bryant, and those characters. South Carolina basically got torched by anybody capable on offense, despite playing in the SEC East with some pedestrian offenses. Miami, on the other hand, to your point, 14th in the nation in total yards given up. Now, maybe an SEC fan would say you play in the ACC, of course. Their division, not great. No bad teams, but no good teams. The whole division's like Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech obviously an anomaly, an aberration this year as being a better team, but a lot of those 6 and 7 win teams that you mentioned, Pitt, Virginia, Duke, those type of teams. But Miami did play one of the tougher out-of-division schedules in the ACC. They did take on Florida State. They took on Louisville. They took on Nebraska on the road. So they played some better teams. When they played Nebraska, Brad Kaya had just been named the starter. He's a freshman. He really gained some valuable experience and proved to be a much better quarterback down the stretch. And I'm already hearing this could be a bit of a stretch and a bit much, but Heisman talk about Brad Kaya for next season. He played that well down the stretch, 25 touchdowns, 11 picks. Duke Johnson, one of the best in the business. So, South Carolina's going to have their hands full. And then when you start to talk to me about mentality and lack of fan support, it could be a long day in Shreveport. Hopefully it doesn't rain. It's not like one of those 44-degree rainy days in Shreveport.
Yeah, and South Carolina, I think, is getting in on the 23rd, and the game is on the 27th. So the players are going to be spending Christmas in Shreveport, and I guess that might be true of Miami too. I'm not sure on that end, but it's just kind of a weird Netherland to find yourself in, I guess.
All right, so regardless, again, I tend to give the nod to the SEC, all things being equal. I think it's the SEC, and they play better competition all year, and they're used to playing these kind of games every week of the season. But again, motivation always a factor in these games, and sometimes you see the big teams show up and their coach works out some angles and pumps some life into them during those 3 or 4 weeks, and they show up and they play the kind of game that they hadn't played all season. And sometimes you see those big name teams show up and just do that, show up and mail it in. So we shall see what the Gamecocks have for us. But leading into that, Connor, I definitely wanted to ask you about the coaching situation, not of Steve Spurrier, seems to be well entrenched at least for another season in Columbia, but in regards to his news conference following the Clemson loss, he was really peppered with questions about his coaching staff, the stability there. He, of course, didn't give us much to go on, but still there was some reading between the lines that there could be some changes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of clamoring for some changes on the defensive side of the ball. There's a lot of thought that Lorenzo Ward probably will not be South Carolina's defensive coordinator when the next season begins. But Will Muschamp was somebody that I think some people on the South Carolina side of things definitely wanted to bring on board. But it seems like athletic director Ray Tanner and Steve Spurrier appeared to have their wires crossed and as to what they wanted. So the Gamecocks ultimately ended up not being a real factor in Muschamp's decision, as it turns out, because it seems like they never truly gave him an offer. And that seemed like would have shored up so many things for South Carolina if that had been able to work out. Because one of the biggest problems South Carolina is dealing with right now is after that Clemson game, he came out and said he's going to be around 2 to 3 more years. And the Gamecocks have been just getting absolutely mauled with that quote on the recruiting trail. Over the past 2 months, they've lost 5 commitments and 3 just in the past 2 weeks since he made that comment. In this recruiting class that South Carolina is bringing in for 2015, it was sort of seen as the saving grace for this program, something that could bolster this program after a down season. And now that that's rapidly deteriorating, there's starting to be a degree of panic there. So Steve Spurrier insisting that he's going to wait to make any changes until after the bowl game. So that's going to be kind of a cloud hanging over this game the whole time. So it'll be interesting to see if that ends up having an additional effect on the mentality of the South Carolina coaches and players.
Yeah, definitely. He also mentioned, speaking of Steve Spurrier in the same news conference, possible suspensions, anything that we could anticipate out of the ordinary, because that's pretty much with the gap between the regular season and the bowl games. Most programs have something going on between there where some players get into trouble, so that's not necessarily a story, but anything unusual there?
No, he was kind of playing it close to the vest with his comments, sort of seemed to indicate that it would just be 1 or 2, if any, players that wouldn't be academically eligible for the bowl game. I haven't heard anything as far as any major names that might be out at this time. So no reason for concern yet, I don't think, for the Gamecocks on that front.
Connor Tapp joins us from 24/7 Sports. Connor, got to hit you up on a couple bowl games here. Liberty Bowl on the 29th, Texas A&M-West Virginia. The Mountaineers, a team that gave Bama pretty much all they could handle on opening night. Then they proceeded through the Big 12 season, pulled off the big upset against Baylor. Faltered a bit down the stretch, losing 3 of 4. Texas A&M, again, as you well know, the big splash on opening night, the opening night, Thursday night, with 52 on the board against South Carolina. Kenny Hill, though, much different perception of his season months later. Texas A&M and West Virginia playing in Memphis, Connor.
Yeah, 2 offenses that should, in theory, be exciting, but in practice they have not been able to execute those exciting offenses very much this season. Clint Trickett, I think his health is in doubt for this one, so it'll be interesting to see if he's going to be good to go. Skylar Howard looked pretty good in relief against Kansas State and got the start in a win against Iowa State. So that'll be interesting to watch. Texas A&M just fired their defensive coordinator. They had a nice infusion of talent from the really bad defense last year. Myles Garrett set an SEC freshman record for sacks with 11. So there's some talent on that defense. It'll be interesting to see if the interim coordinator is able to shape it into something a little bit more useful. And Kyle Allen, in relief of Kenny Hill, he's had about 1 really good game, the Auburn game. And other than that, it's been average to not very good at all. So it'll be interesting to see, maybe with the extra bowl practices and half a year of experience, maybe he takes a step forward in this game. But, yeah, so some potential for some excitement here, but it could also be really ugly, I think.
Yeah, you talk Texas A&M defense, and not much to talk about in recent years. I think it brings me to the Kevin Sumlin situation and what I'm really interested to see out of Sumlin over the next couple of years. So the Big 12 to SEC transition for Texas A&M football. He's got Johnny Manziel to make all sorts of plays and Mike Evans, so they win on offense that first year. They win 10 games. They win 11 games, actually, with the Cotton Bowl victory. They have another successful season, but again, the defense is just horrible. It's almost an embarrassment to the SEC that prides itself on strong defense in that division especially, and across the conference, to have a Texas A&M just give up like 40-some points to Duke in a bowl game kind of thing. And they were almost as bad this year, although the recruiting rankings would tell us that someone is bulking up that defense. Of course, those kids are extremely young. You bring up the freshman with 12 sacks this season, so he's going to be a player, already is a player. So the recruiting rankings would tell us, and the talent that they're bringing on board defensively is strong. We still haven't seen it really play out on the field. Kevin Sumlin has all this star cachet, and as this big-name coach, he's being paid like a top-5 coach. But we'll see if the program can really reach the SEC elite, because it's been more about recruiting rankings and Sumlin and his offense, and he's a $5 million a year coach, than anything we've actually seen play out on the field in terms of winning big games and contending for championships in the SEC.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Texas A&M's defense has gotten worse and worse since joining the SEC. West Virginia joins the Big 12, which people like to poo-poo for having bad defenses. And this is, I think, their best defense since Holgerson's been there. In their, their third year in the Big 12? So it's sort of interesting how that's played out.
Yeah, good question on West Virginia. Definitely their second for sure. And I thought that program was headed in the wrong direction. And Holgerson, after, I think it's their second season, because I think the previous season was the year that they completely annihilated Clemson in the Orange Bowl with Geno Smith at quarterback and Tavon Austin and those characters, Stephen Bailey at wide receiver, who we see in the NFL making plays right now. And then they go to the Big 12, and they were pretty bad last year, 2-7 in the Big 12, but they've turned it around to a certain extent. So this is going to be a difficult one to call for the reason you brought up in the first portion of this conversation. Clint Trickett, his health. I'd like to know if Clint Trickett's going to play in this game and be the quarterback that we've seen all season, who ripped up Alabama on opening night and has had an excellent season. So do you have a feel for this one at all, Connor?
I think West Virginia does more things better. They're a little bit more well-rounded. They're solid on defense, and their offense isn't great, but it's good enough, I think. They've got some playmakers on that side of the ball. And Texas A&M just struggles too much on defense. There's always a chance that they've got the talent to put together a performance worthy of winning this game, but I think 7 times out of 10, West Virginia takes this one.
Okay. All right. Well, you kind of changed my mind on that one. I was thinking Texas A&M, but I get your point on that with the freshman at quarterback, Kyle Allen for Texas A&M. Yeah, he did make a splash in that game 2 against Auburn on the road in the Plains, but since then, wow, LSU really stomped out Texas A&M defensively in that game. So the running game's nothing great. So West Virginia, yeah. If Trickett's okay, they definitely have all sorts of playmakers. Wow, Kevin White's got 100 catches. Mario Alford has 10 touchdown receptions, 62 catches. They've got playmakers in space that could make Texas A&M look even worse on defense in this one. Then we've got kind of the opposite end of the spectrum when we talk offense philosophy and defensive performance. When we go to the Texas Bowl, Connor, with Arkansas and Texas, a couple teams that kind of harken back to the Southwest Conference days, not just in name and rivalry from the 60s, 70s, 80s, but also in style of play. Now, these two teams are going to slug it out, most likely, and we're not going to see a whole lot of points in this one.
Yeah, another pair of 6-6 teams here, but I think these two squads are a bit more excited to be at 6-6 than Miami and South Carolina, and definitely two programs that I think are on the upswing. As you mentioned, Charlie Strong has really whipped this Longhorn defense into shape in just one season there in Austin. Still not good on offense for Texas, really at all. Tyrone Swoops has really struggled taking over for David Ash, and they haven't been able to do very much running the ball either. Arkansas, on the other hand, really good running the ball. Brandon Allen has been banged up a bit down the stretch, took an injury in the 30-0 win, Ole Miss. So it'll be interesting to see how healthy he is, if he takes a hit and is maybe dealing with some things through the course of the game. But Arkansas, they're a bit more well-rounded in my view. They have a really strong defense that came on late. Shut out Ole Miss which even without Laquan Treadwell and some of the injuries they were dealing with down the stretch, that's still an impressive feat. So I think I'm giving the edge to Arkansas on this one. If I'm finally siding with an SEC team here, because I think they're a little bit more well-rounded of a team at this point. But I mean, you got to like how Charlie Strong had this team playing down the stretch, winning 4 of 2 after starting out 2 and 4, and getting some nice upsets over West Virginia and Oklahoma State to get bowl eligible. So I think these programs are both headed in the right direction. But in this particular game, give me Arkansas, Jonathan Williams, Alex Collins. They're going to be fun to watch.
Connor, it's nice to know that I finally got my head straight on one of these games, because that's the same thing. Arkansas, not that it's going to be a blowout. I don't think either one of these teams is capable of blowing out the other because of the defensive ability and because of the offensive inefficiency. Just what Arkansas was able to do against the quality of competition. Texas, yeah, they turned it around well. I keep hearing Charlie Strong is definitely the guy for this program. I'm not sold yet. Yes, he kind of kicked the bad blood out of the clubhouse, out of the locker room. A lot of players left that program, so he very much put down the gauntlet, and he's that type of guy. He's a very polarizing personality. He's that might be a little bit strong because most people like him. He's a very strong personality in a good way, in a positive way. Very inspiring guy, the type guy that players want to play for. So I think that's a great thing. But bringing a program of Texas's caliber to 6-6, I just want to wait and see what he does with this team against better competition. You mentioned the West Virginia win, the Oklahoma State win. I'm going to discount the win over Oklahoma State a little bit more and really just look at West Virginia as being the quality win on the schedule. I think they more benefited from the schedule being front-loaded and losing those games against the Oklahomas and Kansas States and Baylor's and TCU's. Well, TCU was the last game of the season. Those other games, and then it was backloaded with some softies that enabled them to kind of rally and get to 6 wins. Where Arkansas, when you beat LSU and Ole Miss, and then you play Missouri within a touchdown on the road to finish off the season, I'm really going to put some credibility in that. Brett Bielema, not that it's a finished product by any stretch. There's still a whole lot of work to do, but Arkansas, I think, is on much better ground here and a much stronger, not much stronger football team, but for me, decidedly better, and should be able to close out with a win in this one.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right, Connor Tapp of 24/7 Sports joins us. Hey, Connor, we appreciate the time for stopping all that you're doing right now, everything you're working on, and giving us some insight into 3 bowl games here in the South Carolina coaching situation.
Yeah, Mark, ours is a pleasure.
All right, Connor, you take care. We'll talk to you later.
All righty.
All right, folks, this is the SEC in 60. We come your way on Google Hangouts live every Monday at noon Eastern Time, 11 Central. So you can catch us live. Send us some tweets. We will address those in the moment. If you can't catch us live, never fear. We've got the podcast available just a few hours after we've concluded the show. So the podcast available on iTunes and also Podbean. If that's your service, just look up Mark Rogers TV or SEC in 60. And, of course, we're on the SEC Fans Radio Network. So SECRadioNetwork.com. That's every day, Monday through Friday, especially Tuesday through Friday once we get this uploaded for Dr. SEC's radio network there with the SEC Radio Network. So that's 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central every day, Tuesday through Friday, that you can catch us there. Got some great guests on today. Again, Zac Ellis of SI.com and Connor Tapp of 24/7 Sports. So we do this every week with some of the best bloggers and writers across the country, broadcasters as well. So we've got some great guests lined up for future weeks as we will dissect these bowl games. And if you love college football across the country, not just the SEC, again, catch me on YouTube at Mark Rogers TV, also MarkRogersTV.com. Either site, Plenty of videos there for you, constantly recapping games, game previews, analysis of coaching situations, most notably recently with Brady Hoke ousted at Michigan. Of course, the Bo Pelini situation at Nebraska with Mike Riley now in Lincoln, and the Wisconsin situation as they continue to look for a head coach with Gary Anderson moving to Oregon State. So we've broken that down with top bloggers that focus on those teams and conferences. And again, college football videos galore for you to give us your feedback on. So we'd love to hear from you as well. Follow me on Twitter at MarkRogersTV, and we will discuss and debate some college football 24/7, 365. As I think, aside from maybe Rivalry Saturday, when it's the Iron Bowl and the Egg Bowl and Ohio State, Michigan, USC, UCLA, those kind of games, bowl season, I know some of the names are crazy. They're fun. The games are meaningless to a certain extent. But this is the time of year we get to see these conferences actually play each other. Top teams from top conferences go head-to-head constantly, every day, 4 times a day. We're seeing South Carolina, Miami. We're seeing TCU, Ole Miss. We're seeing, of course, Ohio State, Alabama, and seeing Oregon, Florida State. We did not see a Pac-12 SEC game the entire season. That's criminal. And unfortunately, we're not even going to see, with 39 bowl games, one game with the Pac-12 taking on the SEC, the supposed 2 best conferences in college football. And I would have to agree. I don't think that the data completely backs it, but just based on the eye test, I would say that the SEC is still number 1 and the Pac-12 a pretty solid number 2. But they haven't played each other this year, and they're not going to play a bowl game against each other. So that needs to be corrected in this bowl slot as well. The one game we may see, Alabama-Oregon for the national championship, and that may decide the SEC versus the Pac-12. But I love the bowl games. Hope that you enjoy them. Again, join me on Mark Rogers TV. Follow me on Twitter, and we'll talk it up as well. So may God bless you. We'll catch you next week, Monday at noon Eastern, 11 Central for the SEC in 60.